So how often should you change your engine oil? This is quite a complex question and I get asked it quite a lot. And it's also quite a difficult question to answer. So let's just get started. There's quite a few different things that you have to factor in before coming to a conclusion on when you should change it. The first thing you need to think about is what's the manufactured recommended oil change interval? On a lot of the newer cars, it's every 2 years or 20, 25, 30,000 kilometers, which is pretty ridiculous. But you also need to ask yourself, why is it that new cars have got much longer intervals compared to some of the older cars from the early 2000s? And there's quite a few things at play. Number one, engine oil technology has significantly improved since in the last 20 years, and this results in a lot more additives and detergents, friction modifiers inside the oil, so it can actually last longer. That's definitely true, but that's not the only reason why the oil change intervals are longer. The next thing that you need to think about is how have the engines changed in the last 20 years to account for the longer intervals. So in a lot of petrol engines, they're now using direct injection compared to port injection. Now this is really good for emissions as the engines run a lot more efficiently. They can run at a much leaner air-fuel ratio. And because of this, there's less fuel vapors that end up in the oil. So you have less oil dilution, which is great. But also another common trend that manufacturers are doing now is that they're now using smaller displacement engines that are pretty heavily turbocharged compared to 20 years ago. For example, BMW 320i or a 330, they were a 6-cylinder engine and now they're all 4-cylinder. The new 320 and 330i are the B48, which is a 2-litre 4-cylinder. So why are they doing this? Partly due to emissions, fuel economy, same thing really, just using less fuel. Also from the fact that they're able to use economies of scale and use modular components so that there's less R&D developing different engines for different cars, whereas they just build one engine and it goes in quite a few cars. Another really big reason, and this is key, is that between the actual piston and the cylinder wall, a lot of unburnt hydrocarbons like to hide around the piston ring area. And so if you just reduce the size of the engine in terms of its cylinders, this naturally reduces the amount of unburned hydrocarbons inside the engine. And this is really good for meeting the latest emission targets. A side product of this is that you end up with slightly less fuel dilution inside your oil as well. So the oil is actually a little bit cleaner. And thirdly, probably the biggest reason is the fact that manufacturers are extending the oil service intervals on purpose to reduce the total amount of waste product that their cars use. This is from pressure from the global sustainable picture that car manufacturers are using today, where they're trying to reduce the amount of consumables that their cars need. This is a big reason why there aren't many cars that use hydraulic steering anymore, because that's another serviceable item that uses oil. So because they're extending the oil changes, so what likely happens is that a management team comes on board and speaks to the engineers that design the engines and say the engine oil should last 25,000 Ks and or 2 years, make it work. So this is not particularly a fault with the engineers, it's just management, as is normally the case with big corporations. Another thing to think about is, how is the car used? Is it just driven around town, doing a lot of cold starts, not really getting up to temperature? Or does it spend its life just doing highway miles? If it just spent its life doing highway miles, then there's no reason why you can't use the normal manufacturer's specification of 25,000 kilometers. But if the car's driven aggressively, especially on track use, then there's no way that you can use the OEM specification. If you take your car to the track, you really should be changing your oil before and after the track day. If you do a lot of city driving with a lot of stop-start, cold starts, not really getting up to temperature all the time, then the 25,000 kilometer interval is going to be too long. So what do? I go somewhere in the middle. On practically all of my cars, I always change the oil at around anywhere from 8 to 10,000 kilometers, depending on which car it is and how it's being used. Whenever I take one of my cars to the track, I always do the oil before and after. So all in all, it just depends on the car you have and how it's used. But in most cases, the longer service intervals are just way too long. So in probably 90% of the cases, you should really be changing oil at I'd say 10,000 kilometers at probably the maximum. Hope you enjoyed this video today. Stay tuned, check out the store at Shop MC Garage, and I'll see you in a couple days.